Hey everyone, this is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and today I am very glad to be joined by a good friend of mine, a colleague, one of my oldest friends in astrology, Ari Moshe Wolfe, who is here today to begin a series of talks that we have designed together in order to discuss some of the similarities and differences between ancient or Hellenistic astrology, which is the astrology that you'll hear me talk about and that I practice and teach, and evolutionary astrology, which is another very popular, one of the most popular schools of astrology in the world. And it is the form of astrology that Ari practices and teaches. And so I think that this is going to be a really good conversation because I have people who come into my programs all the time asking about the differences between these approaches, what they share in common, what the technical differences are, philosophical differences. And I think sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding, especially around how much all of these different schools of astrology, in particular Hellenistic and Evolutionary in this case, share in common. So my hope is that this series will also allow for some meaningful bridges to be built between these different schools and practices, because to my knowledge, I've never yet seen a Hellenistic practitioner sit down and talk shop and philosophy with an evolutionary astrologer. I practiced evolutionary for a while at the start of my astrological journey and made the shift to Hellenistic. And Ari was one of the initial people who really served as, I would say, like a guide into the world of evolutionary astrology. He really, when I was first learning, I met him in New York City, and he came and told me a little bit about evolutionary astrology, along with a few other people who I met at that time. And we've remained friends and colleagues over the years since. Ari's done some amazing readings for me over time, also Ashley, that really stuck with me and were an important part of my development and just like life guidance too. So I really think that Ari is a special person, and I'm very glad to have him here today. Before we get into that conversation, as always, a few things. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're new to the channel, we really appreciate your support. We're trying to get to 70,000 subscribers on the channel by the fall equinox. It was a goal that I set earlier in the summer. We've almost doubled our subscriber total each month. It's been great to see everyone turn out. If you listen to the show regularly and you're not yet subscribed, it's free to do so. It helps us grow our community and business. We really appreciate it. You can find transcripts of today's talk or any of our talks on the website, nightlightastrology.com. And on the website, I want to take you over there right now to mention just a few things. One is that our next webinar is this Thursday night. If you go to the events page and click on live talks, you will see I'm doing a talk called Venus's 12 Love Languages. And this is about the specific kinds of archetypes and learning lessons that we are here to experience through the placement of Venus by sign. So we're going to be focusing on the unique way that Venus teaches us about intimacy, love, sexuality through the 12 signs of the zodiac. If you can't attend live for that talk, you could register here. You get the recording if you can't attend live. The other thing to mention is the courses. If you go to the first year course, begins on November 16th. This is our next first year program in ancient Hellenistic astrology. Of course, all of our programs I've been deeply influenced by modern forms of psychological astrology, archetypal astrology, have some background in evolutionary. So you're going to get a little bit of a mix of things in this program, but primarily we're focused on ancient Hellenistic techniques. You'll find at the bottom of the page that there are sale rates available until October 15th, and there's need-based tuition assistance. So if you need some help, we want to make sure no one's priced out of studying something that is sacred, that should be available for people regardless of their background financially. So make sure you take advantage of that. We're really glad to have that available for people. At the end of today's talk, after I sign off with Ari, there's an informational video about the program you could stick around and listen to if you want to learn more about what the program includes. I will also be very glad to tell you more about what Ari is up to and how you can get in touch with him. And I will do that at the end of today's episode. So if you like what you hear from Ari and you're like, wow, this is someone I want to tune into, I'm going to also tell you how you can do that before we sign off today. So on that note, I'm really excited to bring my friend and colleague, Ari Moshe Wolfe, to the show. Hey, Ari.
Hello, Adam.
I'm so glad you're here, man. This is like, I don't remember when the idea came up. I remember reaching out, I think it was around New Year's. I feel like it was like New Year's Eve, or maybe it was like the day after or something. But I remember sending you a message and being like, what do you think about this? I really had no idea like what you were going to think, but you were totally game.
Well, we were both having dreams.
That's right. Oh my God. Yes.
I had a couple dreams where I just saw you sitting up and just relaxing. I'm like, wow, it's cool. It's Adam. And you had dreams that we were having conversations.
Yes. Okay. Now I'm totally remembering it. Sorry. It's been a minute since so I reached out to you, I think on Instagram, because I had this dream where we were conversing and it was like in the dream, it felt to me like philosophers in under the grove of trees in Greece, like thousands of years ago or something, or sages in India, or we were conversing. And it just struck me as like, I get a lot of people who come into my programs who are like, what's the difference between these schools? And a lot of people who come from like learning Hellenistic, who come from a background in some modern forms, evolutionary being one of the big ones. And they're like, well, what's the differences? And are the philosophies different? Or what's the difference in techniques and approaches? And frankly, within the realm of traditional astrology, even I did this when I first got into traditional astrology. I think it's a natural part of learning a new discipline that you sort of draw a line in the sand or a little box around yourself, and you go, these are the ways I practice. This is the way that I use the technique. I don't use it that way. I use it this way. And in the process of doing that, I noticed myself, at least initially, and this was happening, by the way, while Pluto was opposing my sun from the 9th to the 3rd, right? Capricorn to Cancer, that I was going like, okay, I've needed to kind of refine and shape and structure and sort of limit my focus. But in doing so, have I become closed down to other schools that, if I think about it, like if I think about my friend Ari and the way you approach life, how seriously you take your spirituality, your growth as a person, your practice of astrology as a sacred offering to the world, I'm not any different. Like Ari is my friend. Our techniques, our philosophies might be not identical, but in spirit, we're doing something that's very, very similar. And for some reason, I just kept getting this feeling like there's so many people, especially in traditional astrology, and I don't mean to throw anyone under the bus because I was one of them, who may just get a little closed-minded or may not realize how much we have in common with other schools of astrology. And I just knew that you would be the person to have this conversation with so that we could lay out the similarities that people may not be thinking of and also explain some of the technical differences for people who could really, be helped by that understanding.
I'm so grateful for this. To me, this is healing. Um, it kind of feels like an interfaith dialogue in a sense, like, you know, someone from this religion or that practice. And I think we miss the point when any modality or spiritual practice becomes an end unto itself. Like, so for me, the value of evolutionary astrology in any modality is simply the way in which it serves our own evolution. I never want anything to become a dogma or a this is the way or this is the only way. So being able to share this conversation just feels so important. I think it's generally something the world is needing right now. Um, Today I was in a steam room with 3 elderly men, and they were all having this very, charged political conversation. And I'm like, yeah, this is everywhere you look, it's very easy to become polarized in certain views and ideas. And so we just need more of this kind of experience right here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me that this will be airing as we're recording it a little bit prior to the eclipse, but this will be airing the day after the eclipse in
Okay.
Pisces with Neptune, right? So and I love that the host of that eclipse from a traditional standpoint would be Jupiter, the traditional ruler in Gemini, right? So if you look at it from that particular view, you could use Neptune as well, right? But if you think about it as Jupiter having this kind of influence, Jupiter and Gemini facilitating this kind of dialogue or conversation
Yeah.
between things that look opposite but share this paradoxical
That's it. Yeah,
sameness,
exactly.
you
Yeah.
know?
And Jupiter squaring that eclipse. So this is very active for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Well, we have a list of questions that Ari and I designed together. And part one of this series is really focused on just understanding the philosophical foundations of these practices. What are they? And really trying, I think our goal today is to establish just how much the spiritual perspective of both of these schools of astrology share in common. But we have a bunch of questions, and so why don't we just dive into them? You
Let's
ready?
do it. Let's do it.
All right. All right. So I just wanted to start off so let's just like give a little overview for everybody. So ancient or Hellenistic astrology is really something that has made a reappearance on the scene in the past couple of decades, thanks to the translation efforts of a lot of modern astrologers and scholars who aren't even necessarily interested in astrology, but brought forth this collection of ancient texts that now a lot of people are studying and bringing those ancient techniques and practices from this earliest era of horoscopic astrology, which also shares much in common with early Indian astrology. And they're sort of bringing those techniques back. And so you'll hear people call ancient astrology Hellenistic astrology, traditional astrology, although traditional astrology, more broadly speaking, could move into things like the medieval era or the Renaissance. Or so ancient astrology typically refers to everything, from like maybe 300-400 BCE through the fall of the Roman Empire, that kind of earliest Greek era, culturally Greek, not necessarily ethnically Greek, the Hellenistic world and what it brought forth. And so some of those earliest doctrines have been like excavated. And so a lot of people are now studying and practicing them. Evolutionary astrology is one of the biggest forms and schools of astrology in the world in the modern era, though its roots in terms of its technical practices are rather recent. I don't know exactly, but I would guess within the past 50 or 70 years or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So setting the stage for all of that, probably if this right now sounds like Greek to you, you probably already have been exposed to both of these schools and may not even know it.
Yes, you
So
have.
hopefully we'll just, this will be just clarifying. But let me ask you first, Ari. So just kind of broadly speaking, what are the, before we get into the technical side, which we're going to do in a future episode, we're just talking about the philosophical foundation. So like, what do evolutionary astrologers believe, I guess you could say? What are the underlying spiritual values or beliefs of the practice of evolutionary astrology?
Okay. And I appreciate how you spoke a moment ago that, at least in terms of the technical component of EA, that's fairly recent. And I would make a distinction between sort of the philosophical framework and the modality and the techniques, right?
Right.
The philosophical framework is pretty old in the sense that it resonates with what I find is sort of at the core of many different spiritual teachings and lineages, that this human experience, this earth, is a template for ongoing soul evolution. And that from the point of view of thinking of ourselves as an evolving being, every part of our life and the total context of this life is deeply relevant and purposeful for our ongoing evolutionary growth. So it's grounded in this framework that recognizes this process of evolution. So you can think of it from a spiritual lens as we're all in this process of self-realization. And self-realization itself has various stages, and you can't ignore the curriculum, so to speak. We're all here in this earth school of awakening is just what it is, and we all have to meet the content. So bringing that into astrology, you then look at the natal chart, and you can think of it on two levels. You can see it from the point of view of the past. Basically, what is the kind of context of the soul's journey that's led to the manifestation of this life in the first place? And again, like the premise of this, just to take it away from astrology, is nothing is taken for granted. So it's not about being overly simplistic and being like, okay, you're having this experience because in a past life you did such and such. I think for anyone that starts to really explore these deeper soul realms, the intricacy and the intelligence of the why, so to speak, behind our experiences are deep. And I think we all begin to unravel that and understand that as we continue to walk our path and sort of unpeel the layers. So the natal chart can be understood from that level. What are the core soul dynamics, the karmic patterns, the evolutionary dynamics within the soul that have led to this life? And the idea is it's rooted in the principle of desire. If you could just imagine the idea of when we leave this life, when we leave this incarnation, the only thing that we take with us as a soul, right? Just to define the idea of soul as, take the body, your personal memories, your preferences, your grievances, your attachments, all of the things that come with this human time space experience. Take it away, you're left with your essence, the soul, that which is continual. The only thing that remains is the internal vibratory reality of the soul itself. And what are we holding on to? What are we still attached to? What are the inner dynamics within us that is then going to impel continued experience? So in this way, it's very similar to maybe more Eastern philosophical perspectives of reincarnation and just seeing that each lifetime is designed for the soul, for us to continue to work out whatever's left, right? It's like the journey towards God is more of an elimination process, working through the next layer and then kind of rebuilding a new identity structure, and that facilitates a new journey of working through the next layer. So on that level, you can look at the chart and say, okay, here's the content that you've been working with. And then two, what's the evolutionary intention of this lifetime? And that's
Mhm.
where the gem is, right? You look at the total circumstantial reality of your life, because the chart won't say, where you were born, what kind of culture, what society, what gender you might be in. And you correlate, you bring context to all of that from an evolutionary lens. Why would you have this experience? Why is this your particular challenge? Basically identifying what is the soul curriculum.
Mhm.
So it's a very compassionate, if done properly, right? Because it really, any modality and technique is going to be as valuable as the practitioner's attunement, right?
Right.
And that's true for
Short
all
side
things,
manner.
right? So if we're really approaching it from that place, we can have this sort of reverence and compassion for both like the unspeakable intelligence and beauty of this journey
Mhm.
and every part of it, how it's orchestrated, and be able to point people back to themselves. Not just intellectually, why is this happening from the point of view of maybe an old school idea of karma, right? It's not about that. It's more everything in its highest understanding is reflecting my own inner reality back to myself. So there's an opportunity for empowerment, self-knowledge, greater psychological self-awareness. And so the evolutionary journey then becomes one of moving through life with knowledge of our agency, right?
Mm.
That I can actually make choices and I'm not stuck, entrapped, entangled, but we all are, just to a certain extent, and that's the journey, right? We're unraveling greater and greater agency in our soul essence, which is eternal and deeply powerful. So let me just see if that's the essence of what I would want to express. Yeah, I'll keep that there. That's the basic philosophical framework, and I, when we get more into technique, then I'll go more into some other facets later.
Yeah, I think so my follow-up question is just because I want to pull from that a few things and just reflect them back and make sure I've understood correctly. So one, we could start off very basically saying that evolutionary astrologers believe that everything is ensouled, that every being has a soul, an eternal divine part of the whole. Is that accurate?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, like we all have a
Yeah.
soul, like
Yeah.
so, and then that soul is in a process of spiritual evolution
Yes.
toward we could call it a God realized state or an enlightened state, something like
Yeah,
that. Is that fair?
exactly. Yeah, those things that are kind of hard to define, but
Right.
whatever that is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly right. And that this happens through a process of transmigration in the material universe. Is that fair?
Yeah, and at least that's one of the ways it happens as far as I know in my own experience, right? I mean,
Right.
obviously, what do we know? But yeah,
Right.
at
Okay.
least since we're here, we know that this is how it's happening here.
Yeah. And that does, in fact, fall in line with most of what the history of yoga philosophy has taught. And they have been carriers of the horoscopic tradition for thousands of years and share philosophical roots with Hellenistic astrology. So I'll say more about that in a second. But the other thing would be transmigration. There's a belief, I should say, that the soul is going to move from one body and lifetime and experience to another, and that there is purpose behind every facet of that process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so finally, the birth chart is then used to establish a sense, because I'm sure you would say you can't circumscribe the mind of God with a chart, right? But you could say we have a sense of where you're at in that process and what some of the core curriculum is on an archetypal level, a
Exactly.
sort of thematic and psychological level, as well as what areas of life and what themes and places, relationships, or job, or what have you, within which these themes and experiences, these evolutionary lessons or curriculum will play out. And
Yeah.
we use that to serve that process for a client or a soul.
Yes, and I would clarify that the chart wouldn't indicate where we're at in terms of our spiritual evolution. It's an important thing for me. It's a question that always comes up for me. There's no aspect or phase or relationship or sign, right, that indicates one stage of evolution being higher than the other. You can't determine where a soul's at on their own evolutionary journey in terms of their own spiritual growth from the chart alone. That
Right.
you have to but archetypally, you're going to see these core soul dynamics, and that has to be brought to that individual soul context.
Yeah.
And I want to say too, people ask, how do you know past lives are real? To me, that's probably the most unimportant part of this work. I mean, I can speak from my own personal direct experience, and I wouldn't even care to embellish it so much because I don't want anything to actually become a belief system, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So when I teach, I want all of this to kind of enter in through the realm of our own direct experience.
Yeah.
So what's essential is to basically say, however we got here, let's
Right.
just acknowledge there's relevance right now, and we have the opportunity to evolve. And that is an accessible, tangible dimension that we can all work with, regardless of our cosmology of reincarnation and things like
Right.
that.
Right. That's beautiful. I love that. And so I think just hearing all of that, for my hope is that a lot of people out there may just first of all just understand, I think, how perennial this philosophy is, because as you said, some of the techniques or the way you use Pluto or the nodes or whatever may be relatively recent. We're going to talk about that more later, but the philosophy is really old, and
Yeah,
it's not just coming from
absolutely.
one tradition either. It's a sort of perennial philosophy that we see across planet Earth.
Exactly.
um okay, so we'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, beautiful. Do I get to ask you to share more about,
Yeah, dude.
and this is something I've been curious about. So I'll say this. Sometimes if I want to hear an astrologer, I'll turn to your channel. And you often say things, I don't feel impelled to listen to a lot of astrologers, but whenever you speak, I've never heard you say something that I disagree with. And I wonder if this is just because of your own spiritual path, or if there's something sort of embedded within Hellenistic astrology that I'm not aware of.
Hmm.
Your perspective does feel very aligned with my own personal spiritual knowledge and understanding. So I'm just very curious, within Hellenistic astrology, is there a particular philosophy
Yeah,
or
that's
orientation around what the heck this is all about?
yeah, absolutely. First of all, let me just say, let me return the compliment in kind, because I, for my own creative process, I have to be very careful what I take in from other astrologers. Like, I don't know why. It's just like, it's like I have to be careful, like, that I'm not bringing in music that's totally different from my own. But Ashley and I, who both of us both had readings with Ari dating back to when we first met and we're starting our yoga studio and stuff. We will tune in to you as well throughout the year from
Ah,
time to time. So, and it's always really resonant for me as well. So,
mm,
which is part of why it's like, oh, my dirty little secret is that one of the people I follow is an evolutionary astrologer. I'm just kidding, but yeah, like
right.
it is. There's a similarity, and I think that's because, okay, so I'll just say this very bluntly. One of the things that I pride myself on is being more attached in some ways to the philosophical roots of Hellenistic astrology than I am to the techniques.
Okay.
There's a lot of the techniques that I love, right? And I think are super cool, but it's actually the love that I was a philosophy major. I started off my studies with ancient Greek philosophy and have always been really compelled by the ancient Greek imagination, the Renaissance that kind of rebirthed it. And so for me, that polytheistic and pluralistic world, which is very similar in ancient India, those two places have been like, just that's my jam. Those are my stations. So I think what I'd love to see more of in ancient astrology in general is more of an adherence and an appreciation of some of the core mystical and spiritual schools that practice this, as
Okay.
opposed to just wrote like uses of the techniques that are just sort of heavy-handed and are not acting within the context of the spiritual um, beliefs that accompanied them. Not to make, I don't mean to level that at everyone. It's just something that I've noticed. Sometimes traditional astrologers are technique heavy.
Right.
But anyway, yeah. So in the ancient world, you have a variety of schools that it's hard to say which school was like the progenitor of horoscopic astrology, because you have within the Greek world, where we are pretty certain that the ancient Western form of astrology emerges from, we have like a clear transmission from, say, Pythagoras to Plato, and then there's a lot of influence that's clearly coming from the Platonic Academy and the Platonic stream of philosophy into the origins of Hellenistic astrology, the first horoscopic astrology. But what makes it complicated is that in uh, Pythagoras was basically a lifelong student of Egyptian mysticism,
Okay.
right? And then in Egypt, we have this really rich dialogue with India, and then we have the same sort of concurrent flowering of Jyotish and Indian astrology around the same time that Greek astrology is coming
Mm.
about. And as far as we know, there's some things that are really unique happening in India, like the nakshatras, for example. Uh, and in the West, there's some unique things that are happening. And then there's also this transmission back and forth. And the ancient world was such a melting pot in some ways that it makes it really hard to say which school. Like, was it yoga philosophy in the whole
Mhm.
Vedic world, or was it Egyptian mysticism, or was it the unique doctrines of the Platonic Academy, or whatever?
Mhm.
But what all of them had in common, and this is something that I did a lot of research on because I did a conference presentation on the subject, is that the core beliefs are very similar across the board. And like, for example, transmigration is largely agreed upon, that there is a soul is largely agreed upon, right? And that, I mean, there's Stoics, there's Hermeticists, there's Orphics, there's Platonists, there's yogis, there's all of these different ways of approaching how the soul enlightens, or what is the process of enlightenment, or like the Stoics aren't necessarily as big on all of this, and a lot of Stoics practiced astrology, but Hermeticists, Platonists, all of these other schools, especially the yogis too, there is a soul, there's a process of transmigration, there's a process of enlightenment. Your life is the field in which that process is taking place. Your actions in this lifetime, as well as previous lifetimes that impact the field in this lifetime, matter in subsequent lifetimes, right? And this process does have something to do with the virtue, like acting compassionately or wisely, or there's sort of some sense of there being like karmic laws that are moral, but there's also this very mysterious sense in which the lot of your life is, like in Plato we see that it's chosen, like that the soul actually chooses it. And as far as I understand, that's something that evolutionary astrologers will often say as well. There's some
Mhm.
participation in the choosing of your curriculum, that you and your guides or God are sort of cooperatively shaping this journey. We see that in ancient astrology too. So, for me, I didn't really feel like Hellenistic shifted a lot of the views I already had when I was my first 3 years learning and
Interesting.
practicing EA. It was very, very similar.
Cool. I wrote down originally when you were speaking what year, but from what you're sharing, like how far back does it go? But from what you're sharing, it seems like it's kind of hard to pin that. Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, we have like a lot of evidence of the earliest birth charts that feature the familiar language of horoscopic astrology, houses, signs, planets, aspects, come within the last 300 years BCE.
Okay.
We see the birth charts developing around that time. Of course, that tradition of horoscopic astrology is emerging out of prior astral omen traditions from like Babylon and other places in Mesopotamia. And so it's like astral omen traditions exist, and then we're starting to see this very particular form with the 12 sign zodiac and
Mm.
delineations of planetary hosts and aspects, and this mandala of interconnected concepts and philosophical meanings behind the placement of rulers and blah blah blah. So that is a unique system that we know starts emerging toward the end of the BCE period, and then it flourishes during the Roman Empire.
Okay. Something that we were talking about is just how there is often maybe sort of an implicit assumption or judgment that older is better,
Right.
right? And so it's interesting to hear that the roots of Hellenistic astrology isn't philosophically very different than evolutionary astrology. Now, it almost makes me think that in general, there's a more soul-centered renaissance happening right now.
Yeah.
just in all areas of life, not necessarily like a specific modality.
Yeah, I mean, something that I think is easily lost on us is that it's a mistake to worship too intensely, too extremely at the altar of the past or the future.
Right. Yeah.
I think of, like, Plato said, for example, he said, "Time is the moving image of eternity." And I think that what the reason that it doesn't matter on one level which era the paradigm comes from historically is because dharma is dharma, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like truth is truth, and so there's the sense in which truth reappears and reestablishes itself in every new era and generation because
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
this timeless flower that
Yeah.
exists.
Beautifully said. So my inner my inner experience of EA is just that. It doesn't even feel new to me. And my inner experience is the place from which the teachings come feel pretty ancient.
Right.
So something a lot of people may not know, um, Sri Yukteswar is actually considered the spiritual father of evolutionary astrology.
Oh, interesting.
So Jeffrey Wolf Green is my teacher. He's the one who brought forward evolutionary astrology, began teaching it in the 70s. It started, as I understand, with a dream
Hmm.
where he actually got this download for some of the core knowledge of Pluto that we'll speak about soon, in a dream from Sri Yukteswar. It was all down, and apparently throughout his process of kind of bringing this work out, his guidance with Sri Yukteswar would reemerge occasionally. For me, just on the path that I'm walking, that's totally reasonable. There's nothing unusual about that,
Sure,
and
sure.
the reality of guidance of from the unseen, right? Um, in his life, Sri Yukteswar, who is known as the guru of Yogananda, in Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda speaks about Sri Yukteswar as being this amazing astrologer, just beyond comprehension. And there's some really amazing quotes from Sri Yukteswar in Autobiography of a Yogi. He even said that Sri Yukteswar was, according to Yogananda, one of the three magi. um, so I consider Sri Yukteswar to be the source of this work.
Mhm.
That's not going to fly well for a lot of people that are looking for where was the book written and when is it documented,
Yeah, yeah,
and
sure.
I'm not needing that because
Right.
I'm looking from inner experience. One thing that Jeff Green said is that this work, this orientation, is actually very ancient.
Mhm.
And one thing I was thinking about while you're speaking about just the origins of Hellenistic astrology, um, I think of time more from a yuga perspective,
Sure.
or the Greek ages, right? And Sri Yukteswar himself wrote about that in his book, The Holy Science. He was writing about this stuff in the 1800s about the astronomy, which is it's another fascinating topic. That our evolution as humanity is more of a cyclic process of a downward arc and an upward arc. So if you go further back enough, you're going to look at a society and a civilization that maybe had a more advanced knowledge of reality than we currently do, that we're actually beginning to remember right now.
Mhm.
So I like to think that what's emerging right now is actually very old and beginning to be remembered by humanity.
Right, which is why, and just to dovetail and add my own little 2 seconds on a soapbox, which is why to me it's so important that we look at the spiritual roots of Hellenistic astrology
Yes.
as paramount, not just the techniques. And that was a big part of what, again, inspired this conversation. But like, just to go back a second, to what you said. So again, just making sure I understand it correctly. So this, when you say that for you it's no problem, I think what we probably both would mean is that we are people who accept that truth can be transmitted in
Yeah.
non-ordinary states of consciousness, that
Yeah.
truth can come through inspiration, that truth is not just found through some kind of empirical or deductive process. Um, what I love about that is that in ancient astrology, one of the things that a lot of academics and historians will skirt past
Okay.
in their extrapolation of ancient texts is that all of the texts say that this was downloaded from Hermes.
There we go.
That this,
There we go.
right? It's like, so I mean, I've used the word
Yeah.
downloaded, of course, but that there's a sense of like, where did this came from? It came from Hermes. What does that mean to
Yeah.
an ancient person? And my understanding of just the very basic experiences I have had with indigenous healers in South America who are coming from, I think, a more archaic consciousness, like that connected to the cosmos, to the gods, to the plants, and to these states of consciousness that come through entheogens. My experience of just that glimpse into that worldview and those states of consciousness makes me think that when an ancient sage is saying that, they mean it.
They mean it. I have the same orientation, yeah. I'm
It's
inclined
not
to feel
just,
the same way.
yeah, that's my experience. I mean, that's how I see it. That they're not saying that to just tip their cap in some obligatory sense to a god, like, I'm the genius, but thank you, Jesus. It's
Right,
that's
exactly.
they really mean it,
Yeah.
So I think that we share in common, that because this, you could think of these teachings, and it's not, by the way, I want to make sure we issue this qualifier. None of these things are like, I don't think either Ari or I are here today to tell you what to believe or think, right? We're just here to tell you what the beliefs of these schools of astrology are. And what I think is amazing about this is that, again, you have this sense that these teachings are perennial and, in a sense, timeless. And so we have to be really careful that we're looking at our philosophical basis and not just our technical basis, because the philosophical basis is clearly present in both schools throughout thousands of years.
I love that. Yeah, this feels very Jupiter and Gemini. It seems likely that the origins of Hellenistic astrology are from the same ancient places that EA is speaking from. And
Yeah.
then you're just looking at from these different Gemini angles, but really there's an underlying shared core philosophical framework at the core of all of this, and I love that.
Yeah. It also, it to some extent, like, ancient astrologers literally said in many texts and in many places that astrology was a language, that it was a language written in the sky from the divine.
Wow.
And if we think about that, language evolves, language changes. Like, I used to say cool. Now the kids say fire. You know what I mean? Like, we
That's it,
have,
yeah.
and the sky has dialects and ways of speaking that change. This is always how I've understood the ongoing novelty of astrological technique and language. It's
Uh,
because that language is living and itself evolving. Do you think that's a fair way of looking at it?
Beautifully said. If there was only one technique and one language, it wouldn't be what it is, right? If
Right.
the truth itself is so encompassing, if it's a language that speaks the intelligent design of creation, it would have to be by its nature so available to be accessed from possibly every angle possible. And that's why there are endless techniques,
Mhm.
endless ways of organizing the sky on a chart, endless things that you can do with astrology. I mean, Hellenistic astrology as well as Vedic astrology is great when it comes to techniques and practices, and there's so much out there, and you can learn about this forever. And I think that is a testament to the fact that yes, that which is whole and undivided could never possibly be codified and sort of crystallized as a singular form. It
Right.
would have to be, and that's to me also kind of how I think of God or how I think of love. Its very nature is going to be available literally in any way at all. And
Yeah.
it's not that statement isn't to say that, okay, sure, you can do whatever you want with astrology. I think there's real medicine in it. There are actual techniques and ways of looking, ways of organizing, ways of thinking, ways of languaging and putting it together that actually work, that actually serve benefit in all the unique ways that love can kind of make its way into wherever we're available to receive it. That's how I
Yeah.
think of that.
Absolutely. It's like, astrology is a language as creative as poetry, because
Yeah.
I mean, what we're doing is we're utilizing the language to um, speak uniquely and relatively to each soul about absolute eternal things. And so it's like, yeah, I just couldn't agree more with how you put that. That was so beautiful. I want to ask, just jumping around a little bit, a couple more personal questions and questions about beliefs before we maybe end with a few notes on techniques, which will preview maybe our next talk, where we can start actually breaking down some of the differences in techniques, but try to continue drawing those different uses of techniques back to the same core values or practices or beliefs. One of the questions I have for you is, like, just Um, what what is it about this practice of astrology? Because you practice it and teach it. Obviously, there's value if you're going to go see an astrologer in terms of using the chart and helping you understand your evolutionary journey as a spiritual being in this lifetime through the birth chart. But what do you find about this practice of astrology itself in your life
Mm.
as a practitioner, as a teacher, that is aiding in your own process, or how does it contribute to your own spiritual life or growth? I'd love to hear you reflect on that.
Okay. It's unspeakable. So, you've spoken a lot about your journey with ayahuasca and how ayahuasca led you to astrology. In some creative way of expressing it, it's a little bit opposite for me. I was involved in astrology very, very early on, because there was always this fascination and intuitive sense that there's more to this. And the moment the rabbi, because I grew up Orthodox Jew, the moment I learned in the Talmud, astrology was acknowledged as existing, it was a question of whether you're allowed to practice it or not. But the very fact that they were having a question about whether you can practice it meant that it must be real. So as an Orthodox Jew, I was like, oh my God, I don't care if it's allowed. These sages are saying it's real? Like, what?
Yeah.
Right. And my next step was then to like, is there a way for me to study? And that's like the first place that I went, studying Rambam, Maimonides, and seeing what did he have to say about astrology. That was my gateway drug to Google and everything else.
Love it.
Um, but I just knew I came into this world with that intuitive sense of there is something more, and I wanted to understand like deeply. I'm a seeker at the core
Mhm.
of my being. Um, so as I began to explore, and then the EA work, just it was destined for me to continue with this work and take on this lineage. It's a part of my contract for sure. Working with plant medicine, um, e especially when that was first introduced to me, my early experiences were just sort of like breaking my heart open in recognizing the holographic infinite nature and truth that's reflected in the language of astrology. So it's become for me, studying astrology is a path of cultivating and deepening my direct knowledge and understanding of self and reality, deepening in my own direct experience. So it's not about, take Uranus and the associations that we can learn with Uranus, like shocks and surprises and trauma, but the actual inquiry. What does Uranus reflect relative to who I am? What does it speak to relative to the nature of reality? And so I see every planetary function through that lens. I'm wanting to understand, how is this speaking to some facet of the whole creation or some facet of my total inner being, right?
Mm.
So my own spiritual practice has and does continue to expand upon my knowledge of these archetypes as it reflects more of reality. And then the other way around, right? Doing readings for people, my prayer when I meet with someone is that it's going to be healing. And I'm acknowledging that whatever's happening in this space, I'm meeting people on their evolutionary journey. And what I'm able to communicate and teach is what I'm willing and available to learn. So I pray, may I teach what I'm here to learn. Have me teach what you would want me to learn. May I give the miracles that I am to receive as well, acknowledging that in the giving and receiving, they are the same. And so working through the archetypal language of astrology and the EA understanding, see, it's like an EA understanding that kind of drops the EA, right? It points to the moon.
Mm.
And I'm trying not to give too much attention to the finger, but I'm trying to use that to come back home to direct insight. But meeting with the soul and actually seeing it playing out and actually being able to grasp within my own soul where their own evolutionary growth is. If I can see that, which means I'm translating the archetypal energies through a sort of intimate, real seeing of another, and then if I can articulate that in a way that they can hear it, man, the immense amount of growth and healing that's taking place there, right? For
Yeah.
me and for that individual. Um, I think if I wasn't teaching and doing sessions, I would probably feel very confused and lost,
Mm.
because doing this work is one of the most direct ways that I am continuing to affirm and ground and sort of anchor my own realizations.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so for me, studying and practicing this work is really about continuing to understand just who I am. And I'll say one more thing on this. There's also, as I'm going through a transit, right? Like Uranus opposite my Pluto, or right now I'm going through my Pluto square right now. Having that map is infinitely helpful. I'm sure you and everyone who's studying this work can really appreciate what I'm saying. To objectify archetypally what's going on in my life, and then to kind of come back and say, okay, I'm having these experiences. This is what I'm facing. But let's look at the symbology. What's the evolutionary intention? What are the teachings? So coming back to almost like the beginner's mind,
Mhm.
what are the teachings on Pluto? How can I reapproach this from a very clear and available place to learn and see the challenging circumstances of my life in a helpful way? So just, looking at the transits and all those things to then be able to cultivate a more empowered understanding of the natal chart and my
Mm.
own life and my experiences. I never want any interpretation or view to lead me or anyone into a disempowered, I guess I just got to accept it and deal with it. That's never what love, creation, creator, life wants of us, right? Like our purpose in this life isn't to just sort of accept some sort of disempowering fate. I think there's a greater invitation, if we accept it, to explore a reinterpretation of experience that actually it bypasses nothing, but it allows us to really grow and cultivate more knowledge of who we truly are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Church. I love it.
It can get really, so for you, I'm just gonna guess it's very similar for you, but I would love to hear how your work with astrology also is, and I'm very curious to hear you speak about Jesus as well, if we have time. Because I know that you've grew up Christian and Jesus had been a big part of your journey. You've gone very deeply into, medicine work, but I'm very curious to hear how both astrology informs your own spirituality, but how does it connect, if at all, to your roots with Christianity? I'm very
Mm.
curious about that.
Oh man, that's such a good question too. Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think that um, the basic thing that I had already, these basic things that I had already believed when I started astrology and was practicing evolutionary astrology, that were reiterated through experiences with ayahuasca and entheogens, and also to an extent in the Christian church, where your life has a purpose, God has a plan for your life. I mean, those are, people hear that Christian language and they might it might not might rub the wrong way. But I really was raised as a preacher's kid with the idea that your life is for you. It's not happening to you. It's happening for
Yeah.
you. Like that was, I grew up with that, and then found that there was a much broader universal context in which that happened to be true, that existed in and outside of Christianity. That was the entheogenic experience, really, in a nutshell, was like, these teachings are universal, and the and then I think so. I think when I go to Hellenistic astrology in particular, one of the things that I love about Hellenistic astrology is that the and this is something that I heard from Indian astrologers and was already discerning in reading some of the texts from Hellenistic astrologers. When I was in India, I went and I spoke at a conference in Calcutta and had the opportunity to visit in the home of an Indian astrologer and then spend some time listening to lectures from Indian astrologers. And one of the things that was said was that the study of Jyotish, or just call it Indian astrology broadly speaking, is that for the practitioner, the study of this language itself is a kind of yoga. It's like that when you study and when you learn these teachings, you're getting into some of the you're getting into a divine place that's purifying just by the nature of its study. And that as sages of astrology, the act is like moving meditation. You see the events happening in the valley of the world, but you're able to see within them the dynamics of the planets, which is the orchestration of divine will and creation. And that draws you closer into a trusting personal kind of bond with the divine. And so that would be like the primary reason for actually practicing. And we see that in the ancient world too, where the way that practitioners talk about the study of astrology, apart from actually reading charts for people, is that the study itself allows for this kind of moving meditation
Mm.
where you're able to walk through life without attachment, because you have this perspective of the divine will moving through every last,
Mm.
every
Mm.
movement of every blade of grass. You just are like,
Mm.
okay. And the astrology gives you this awareness of it that allows for this kind of meditative movement. And that would be like the primary reason for practicing for a sage in the West,
It's
too.
so
Many of them,
beautiful.
right?
Wow.
But then secondarily, it's like, well, why would we serve the anxieties of human beings who are obsessed with whether or not they're going to get money or a job or a spouse or whatever, if the point is to be using this language as a kind of communion with the divine? I asked that question to a practitioner in India because it just struck me as like, well, if this sounds like it's a practice of yoga, how did we get to being like, sorry, Becky, you're not going to get a car, but you're gonna get laid off, or like when astrology goes into like serving the anxieties of human beings who are attached to things in the world of
Right.
karma, it seems like a bad use. And he was like, well, actually, what's happening is we are honoring and acknowledging where every soul is in its spiritual journey. And what's even if we might end up talking about health, or we might end up, because Jyotish can be very mundane. Like you could be talking
Mhm.
about health or jobs or marriages or like,
Right.
and sometimes the readings don't necessarily focus on, like, it's not going to be like an evolutionary reading, or not necessarily the way I would read. And in ancient astrology too, it can be kind of prescriptive. It's like dealing with the unfolding of destined events and so forth. But the reason that this was still considered holy is that by degrees, the soul is actually in the process of surrendering itself to the
Mm.
fact that divine will is at work in their life. And even if they're coming in attached to whether or not they get the job, when the astrologer is able to speak truth to the unfolding of their destiny, which is more likely the more attached they are to outcomes, by the way, then there's this way in which the soul is gradually saying, okay, so I'm in a universe that includes karma. I'm in a universe where not all of my attachments and desires are going to come to
Mm.
manifest.
Mhm.
Maybe there's reasons for that. Why would the gods do this or that?
Mm.
So it actually is like homeopathic. It gradually sort of treats and brings awareness. And like, so for me, one of the things that really like, so sort of philosophically was satisfying about ancient astrology is I developed a lot more techniques and tools for dealing with a lot of the really mundane stuff that people wanted to talk about with me, that I'd often get really frustrated about and be like, look, I want to talk about your evolution. You want to talk about whether or not to buy a car, like,
Right.
and like, so I feel like in some of what happened was I was able to have some techniques at hand to address certain mundane things and then hopefully turn conversations to deeper things, right?
Mm.
And so that was a way that the ancient philosophy sort of like it captured me, because at heart, that's what I really want to talk about is the evolutionary potential of every moment in our lives. Or I would much prefer that we look at what's happening and find a way to reflect on the divine at work in the moment. And most of the time, I'm able to get there. But one of the things I like about ancient astrologers is they were pretty patient with respect to being able to just like also address people's ensconcement in the karmic world. So that's valuable. But anyway, going back to the other part of what you asked, for me, what I really love about astrology in general is that it really is that like I have found, like, okay, Mars in Cancer transited my natal Mercury yesterday, went right over the top of it, and I had to pay $500 for a broken sink.
There you go.
A technician had to come out and fix it, and I had to spend money on it. And so there was this very mundane level at which the astrology is like, see, it works. But then there was this other level at which I was invited in to explore other kinds of themes where the event is sort of synchronistic for things that are going on inside of me. And like, what other language have I ever encountered in my life that allows us to validate the most
Mm.
mundane of experiences while constantly inviting us to take our sandals off and be like, well, this is holy ground too. It's a sink that's broken, but it's just as holy as anything else.
Wow. I really appreciate this. I have a Gemini North node. So for me, it's like an ongoing growth edge to actually open my mind to the expression of truth beyond this like fixed, got to talk about God, or it has to be about realization, right? I'm actually going to be taking this and sitting with this a little more, the holiness of the mundanity, and addressing mundane concerns about places, things, and objects, and really being able to meet that content and the relevance of that for people on their journey, because astrology speaks to it. It's like astrology is going to encompass literally all of it. I just
Right.
really appreciate that.
Yeah, man. Yeah, totally. It's funny because, yeah, there's a lot of things working in me right now too. Your
It,
other
it,
part of,
it, it, it almost makes me more interested. It's like some things like, maybe I'll learn some of these, because I've kind of, there are certain areas that it hasn't been relevant, so I haven't heard it. It hasn't, but it's like, oh, I can see value in this and this, yeah.
no, that's the exact same thing. In fact, I was telling Ashley, I was like, you know what? I would really love to just brush up with Ari on all the Pluto and polarity points, like, because it's been so many years. It'd be so nice to hear you speak to those things and bring some of those things back into my practice. It's been so many years since I've used them, and there's just such wonderful techniques. But more importantly, they're wonderful techniques in the way that you express them. Like, if anyone is ever like, where do I want to study evolutionary? I'm always like, Ari, go to Ari. He's solid.
Yeah.
But you had mentioned like the Christian thing, and I think what I find about Christianity that's really interesting is like one thing that I really carry with me from my Christian experience, aside from the fact that I see Christ consciousness as one of a number of examples of a kind of consciousness that is a model for us, that acts as a kind of icon or symbol for the journey that we're on and what we're cultivating. So I see Christ as a Buddha consciousness, Christ consciousness. Figures like these to me are they now serve as like a guidepost or a lantern of some kind. I'm sure you probably feel the same way.
Yeah.
Um, so, but with Christianity, one of the things that I really take with is the importance of failure. Because there was a book that I read that really had a big impact on me, a book called Silence by Shusaku Endo, who is, I think he's Catholic, but he was raised, I think it was like, he was a Buddhist in Japan, but then raised Catholic. And he writes just so carefully and beautifully about the intersection of some of the values and almost like the thoughts of Buddhism and Christianity in that book, Silence, which is about a couple of missionaries that go to Japan from Portugal, I want to say, trying to convert Japanese people to Christianity. And they themselves end up being converted to Buddhism. It's a very interesting book. I loved it. But one of the things that happens in the conversion experience of one of the Catholic fathers or whatever was he's being tortured by the officials that capture him and realize that he's like trying to, they don't want him there, right? So they're saying, well, like, look, we're either going to kill you and you can become a martyr for your faith, or we're going to kill you or we're going to let you live, but then you have to acclimate and become a Buddhist and become like a citizen of Japan. You have to acclimate to our ways, right? And he finds himself unable to be a martyr. He's just not strong enough. And he's looking at this picture of Jesus that they're asking him to spit on before. And if you spit on this picture of Jesus, then we'll let you go and you'll become a Buddhist. You'll integrate into our society. And he looks down at Jesus and he's admitting, Jesus, I'm too weak to become a martyr. And Jesus is like, perfect. Now you can be a real Christian because you've admitted that you're weak enough. And so he goes he becomes a Buddhist,
Yeah.
acclimated, and has like somehow sunk right into a real Christianity.
Yeah.
It's just so beautiful. I love that transition. And like one of the things that I find that the Christianity that accompanies me is this Christianity of like grace and mercy and compassion and forgiveness, and knowing that I don't get somewhere spiritually by being strong all the time, right? I get somewhere spiritually most frequently through the vehicles of humility and being able to just be really honest about where I'm at, and be willing to fail along the way, and that those failures somehow bring me into a more honest and connected state within myself. And that I find that it's weird how how much self-righteousness and how little tolerance there is for failure within
Mm,
many spiritual traditions. And I think that's like a perversion of the tradition, right? But it's like, to whatever extent we're saying that you're spiritually, you're only as good as you perform on the level of virtue, we've just not gotten that failure is an absolutely essential part of the curriculum, because we can't grow mercy or grace or forgiveness or compassion. We can't grow our halos without that part of it. And so that's really the core teaching that stuck with me. But I find that like astrology is constantly reaffirming that, because we find ourselves in the midst of real life dramas and difficulties, and if we allow for those things through the archetypes to be a reflection on how this shortcoming, this failure, is also an opportunity, and it's a gift.
mhm,
It's a grace that's being given to me.
mm.
Then I'm really in receipt of something special, and my evolution can keep unfolding. And like, I think astrology is teaching us that all of the time, because it gives us that perspective of mercy within every event.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Um,
Oh man, I could jam with you for hours, bro. I love hanging out with you.
yeah, yeah, me as well. Me as well. It's such a joy. We haven't done this in years. I mean, we've never really done
No,
it on this level,
no,
so I'm really
no.
grateful.
This is great. Why don't we close? Do you have a minute to close with just one last question?
Sure, yeah,
All
I
right.
do.
So last question, which is going to set us up for our next episode on technique. Um, what are, I mean, there's lots of techniques, obviously, but what are some of the core characterizing techniques of
Mm.
evolutionary astrology? And then maybe I'll say just a few things about Hellenistic.
Okay. I'll preface this with there's technique and then there's insight. So to me, the purpose of the technique is not to look at the chart and then see a technique.
Right.
I think the technique is a vehicle for a certain philosophical understanding that can be correctly and usefully applied. So the technique is rooted in the understanding between the soul and the human ego structure the soul creates for itself. So
Mm.
I'll briefly describe this philosophically, and then I'll bring it to the natal chart. From a soul point of view, we interpret or understand the unique personality structure, which we call the ego, self-identity, self-construct, as a projection that the soul manifests of itself. Right? So Jeff Green described it as a focusing agent. And that focusing agent serves as a vehicle through which the soul can have the human experience, right? So I think of the ego structure itself as a satellite to the soul, in the sense that it follows suit with whatever the intentions and needs of the soul are. Like the ego structure, our self-concept doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
It exists for a reason. And our sense of self is going to shift and evolve as we evolve as a soul being. And so there's no reality to our self-concept other than who we're projecting ourselves to be. So from that lens, we're looking at the natal chart and particular planetary relationships as a way to understand what is the soul's basic evolutionary intention. Okay, so when we think about evolutionary intention, it's underneath the surface of all the comings and the goings and the challenges that manifest on this life journey and the good things. Where are we growing and awakening to our essential timeless nature? And each soul has their own unique archetypal curriculum. How is that being played out through a particular human experience? So this translates to, in a simplistic way of describing it to start, the relationship between Pluto and the lunar archetype, in particular the south and the north node of the moon, but including the moon as well. Pluto corresponds to the underlying evolutionary intention. It speaks to the kind of evolutionary dynamics that have been at play in prior lives leading up to that are relevant, because this lifetime isn't necessarily connected to all particular, it's a larger philosophical concept. All the themes that are relevant to this lifetime and the evolutionary content that we're working out. So let's say you have, Pluto in the seventh house, broadly, right? This is going to say a soul's evolutionary curriculum is going to be linked to evolving through all things relationship, desires and attachments to, I need to be pleasing, I need to be liked, affinities to other people. And so within that, we're going to find ourselves manifesting all kinds of experiences in order to bring out the psychological edge of our own self-knowledge, right? Um, our partner's going to walk out on us and we're going to feel Pluto disempowered, or we're going to be rejected for being who we are. And we're going to face the question, do I embrace who I am, or do I fit in to be accepted because of my addiction to affinity? We're going to be the leader. We're going to be the follower. But from a Pluto point of view, every relational experience in whatever form it expresses is pointing back to where we're evolving and growing as a soul. And it's going to mean at times letting go. It's going to mean empowering ourselves to make new choices, all of the things. The context for that, that alone doesn't say anything, right? Pluto in the 7th house has no particular context other than the archetypal intention for evolution. You look South Node, just to provide a basic framework. This says, in the past, here are the kinds of identity structures that the soul has created for itself. Adam Ginsberg beautifully describes it as the pattern of identity making, which I just love, that has served as a vehicle for these particular evolutionary intentions that the soul's been working out. So, let's say you put the South Node in the 8th house, right? So you have Pluto in the 7th relative to the South Node in the 8th. Naturally, that's going to provide a very particular and focused kind of context for how the soul has been playing out these 7th house desires. It's going to literally be happening through forming deep attachments and bonds in all the 8th house kinds of experiences of loss and betrayal. But that North Node now is existing in the 2nd house. So you look at that North Node as in part symbolizing an ongoing evolutionary direction for the soul. That's going to evolve our own existing limitations relative to that natal Pluto position, right? Because the known framework for how we've been meeting our evolutionary curriculum, so to speak, has been through that lens of the South Node ego structure. Basically, as we're evolving, we're going to think of ourselves in a new way. So the framework of knowing myself with that 8th house is I'm identified with this bond, with this resentment. This person left me. I need this person. All of these core 8th house identifications, and also all the gifts that come with it, are going to be how the soul has been facilitating that 7th house Pluto journey. With the ego structure in the 2nd house, there's going to be a growing orientation to what do I need? How can I tend to my own inner garden? How can I care for my essential needs and my own values? It's about building self-value and self-esteem. Well, then you have a 7th house experience. You're in a partnership and they say, yeah, I don't really like it when you do that. The 2nd house orientation will be, I feel hurt. I feel betrayed, but actually I don't have to hold on to that. What is it like to know myself in a new way, which says, I'm okay, and it's okay for you to feel that way. My identity isn't defined by my the energy and the affirmation that I get from you. So that's like a simplified example. And just to recap the essence of this, what's helpful to appreciate, because this is where technique can easily become heady and linear and confusing, and then we forget how simple it's wanting to be. We can't evolve other than through our emotional body, right? We have to be able to emotionally integrate our experiences and internalize our experiences in a new way in order to not fall into the same grove in the record, so to speak, the same patterning, right? So the evolution of a self-concept is a reflection and really follows our own desire and willingness and availability to evolve.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love what comes to me right away is that looking at the chart in terms of what the soul is trying to do for the sake of evolving, and then trying to find the context within which that has been taking place or will continue to take place, and trying to look for some signs or signals as to what may be regressive as opposed to what may serve for further evolution, I think is a process that I see it certainly as a still a very strong part of my practice, although the techniques I use to get there or discern or delineate
Right.
that are different, right?
Right. Exactly.
But that's the thing that we actually have in common, is that there's not one person who comes into my practice, as I'm sure there isn't with yours, regardless of the paradigms we use, that isn't saying, why am I here? What should I be focused on?
Exactly.
What possibly could I get hung up on? And what's the remediation, or what advice do you have so that I can continue to grow? Like, 99% of my clients, that is exactly what they come in wanting to know. Whether the techniques are exactly the same or not is, I, I don't say like irrelevant. Like, it matters that we have techniques that can speak to truth, but to think that the technique is the truth would be the finger in the moon again, right?
Exactly. Exactly it. I
Yeah.
once heard a talk of yours, and I was like, wow, I would say the same thing, but you are not addressing points that I would have addressed to get there.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
just found that absolutely beautiful.
One idea that I had, and we haven't talked about this yet, so I'll just introduce it on camera and see what you think. I thought, what we should do is we should get a chart that is
Yes.
a chart that we can say, look, this is the approach you take to get there. This is the approach that I take to get there. We're getting to the same point, because I just I know deep down, because I've seen so many charts where I go, oh, if I was in EA, I just would have done it this way.
Mm,
I would have gone through the nodes or what have you. So that's really brilliant, and a nice succinct like summary for now, because the intention of our next talk is to really get into some of the nuts and bolts of
yes.
how the different traditions utilize different techniques to get to some of the same desired conversations.
Yeah. And I would just want to qualify what I shared regarding technique. People ask me, when you look at the chart, do you look at the nodes first? Do you look at Pluto? And I say, I don't know if I do either.
Right.
Again, it's like the EA and the technique is really to provide a framework for understanding. So I think of Pluto and the nodes as a sort of philosophical skeletal framework that
Hmm.
provides a soul level context for the rest of the chart.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Um, I can't wait to get into this on a deeper level. What I'll say right now, just to like broadly qualify the techniques of Hellenistic astrology, many of those techniques, I would say their strong point is in being able to delineate more concrete, specific themes, events, and topics in people's life on the mundane level.
Mm,
So I find that the challenge is always like, for example, I would say I'm better now with my Hellenistic techniques than I would have been at describing or being able to look at a chart and tell pretty specifically when someone is going to have a spouse that's mentally ill that they end up divorcing.
mm,
I can see concrete things, not crystal clear. I'm not omniscient, but the techniques of ancient astrology are very predictively. It's like a scalpel.
mm.
I remember seeing an Indian astrologer while I was studying Hellenistic, and he was able to predict down to a week that Ashley would get a rash on her arm. Right? I mean, it was like crazy specific.
Wow.
I'm not that specific with my practice, but um, you know, horary is another traditional form and technique. A lot of it's very predictive, but if that predictive skill isn't used artfully for a soul-centered approach that is
Mm,
ultimately wanting to take us beyond attachment to results and outcomes, then it's really about how and why we use them, right? Which is more important. So it's like one of the things I love about evolutionary is that the technique is really in service of this, providing this context. Whereas in many ways, I find that the context that a client brings to me that maybe is a hard starting point for me, I'm able to much more easily address with
mm.
Hellenistic techniques. But then the challenge becomes finding my way back to that bigger context,
Okay.
if
Oh,
that makes sense.
yeah. That's fascinating. I mean, I have so many questions.
Yeah.
I think we have to close, but my mind is, I'm excited for the next part of the series.
Yeah. And the other thing I
Uh,
want to make sure we do in the next part is I want to I want to just propose some ideas about how this shift in our understanding about the nodes of the moon, because Hellenistic has a very particular understanding of the nodes. Ancient Indian astrology has a particular understanding of the nodes, and then EA has what looks like a very different understanding. I
mm,
don't think they're as different as people think. I went on probably 4 or 5 different places and groups that I did a talk on the development of the nodes of the moon across astrological
oh,
history and how the meaning has
cool.
changed. one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, especially since developing this series with you, is that I think I can see I think there's some pathways to making some very meaningful and not disconnected. There's more connection than I think people realize historically, even between the ancient view of the nodes and the modern view. So I have some ideas about that I want to throw out there when we talk again as well.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah. I want to make sure I can plug your work, Ari Moshe Wolfe. I remember, just so you guys have context, when I was first starting meetup groups of astrology students in New York City, just getting my career started, Ari came over. I remember doing some yoga in my apartment with him. He came
with Adam Summer.
That's right, with Adam Summer, right? It was you, me, and Adam, and you guys were the ones who were like, "Hey, do you know anything about evolutionary astrology?" I was like, "No, I'm like brand new." And then I was off in taking everything I could, reading all of the books from Jeffrey Wolf Green and Stephen Forrest, and arimoshe.com is where people can find you. I'm assuming you have events and readings and things like that on your website.
Yes.
And then most importantly, if you like Ari's vibe, and I know probably a lot of you are really resonating with Ari's approach today, on YouTube you can find him at Heart and Soul Centered Astrology. So I couldn't recommend more highly that you put him on your subscription list. You're going to find the same care for the soul that you find on my channel. I think we're cut from the same cloth in that respect. So I think you'll find a lot of really great content there. And if you feel like exploring the EA world more, I couldn't put you in the hands of a better guide than Ari.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Yeah, you bet. Well, thank you everybody for listening, and we will be recording again soon. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll get another episode out and continue this talk. So stay tuned. And after I sign off, there is an informational video that I've tagged on to the end of this week's videos about the upcoming Year 1 course. If you're interested in learning more about that, after we sign off, there's a little bonus info video you can check out. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye. Hey, everyone. I'm glad that you're sticking around to hear more about the Year 1 program that's coming up. The program starts on November 16th of this fall, and I am here today to tell you all that the program includes and why I think you really like it if you're thinking about studying astrology. So a few practical details about the course as well. The class begins November 16th, as I mentioned, but it takes place on Saturdays from 12 to about 2 or 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So that's 11 to 2 Central, and typically classes are about 2 hours long. Sometimes they run over with Q&A and discussion, but you can always plan for about 2 hours and you won't miss any of the actual lecture content for the day. You may have to duck out a little early if Q&A or discussion is extending. Sometimes it does, which is why we say between 2 and 3 hours, but typically it's around 2. All of the classes are recorded, so if you can't attend live, you are more than welcome to watch the recordings at your own pace and on your own time. You have lifetime access to the recordings, and everything is housed on a student website. I want to actually give you just a little preview of what that student website looks like. So I am going to open up my own version of Thinkific, which is the platform that we use. So here's some of my courses. These are all the Nightlight courses I teach. You can see on the page. But I'm going to tune into, let's go to Nightlight 28, which is the section that began in June of 2024. So here you're going to see that we have orientation instructions, course information, class links, and calendar. Everything that you need to know how to access the course is there, and you'll have a version of this in your own panel that you get set up with when you enroll. And then our lessons are laid out. So lesson 1, we have the video, the audio, the slides, the transcript. We have the Q&A box transcript so you can see what people were saying in the chat box during class. We have flashcards. We have a workbook. We have planet and sign glyph flashcards. We have bonus material, videos that we like from YouTube that we link you to. Say, check this video out, check that video out. They go along with some of the things we talked about in class. So every lesson has material for you to go as far as you want with, but the main thing is the video, audio, slides, transcript, etc. are all listed there so that you can download and watch it on your own time if you can't attend live. Again, the live classes do happen on Saturdays for this cohort, starting November 16th. That is our first day of class. And then going forward, it always meets on Saturdays, and we give you the class schedule to map out. And the breaks that we have, the study sessions that we have, everything's mapped out on the class calendar for you. So those are just a few practical details that, just to kind of start us off with. So I'm going to take you over to the website, which is nightlightastrology.com. And I'm going to share with you some information about the program and sort of walk you through what it includes and what you can expect. So it is an almost year-long program. We typically finish between 10 and 11 months out of the year. It can depend a little bit on some of my teaching and scheduling, because sometimes I teach at conferences and it may delay some of our modules by a week or something like that. But it's typically around 10 to 11 months that the program lasts. So we call it our first year program. At Nightlight, we have a program for absolute beginners. You may want to check that out if you are like brand spanking new. That would be 8 to 10 hours of content that's really meant to set you up for the first year course. We sort of assume that if you're coming into the first year program, you already know a little bit about astrology. For example, you have some familiarity with the signs, planets, and houses. Maybe you know what aspects are, but you want to learn more about what they are. But if you are really at the very total entry level space, then try astrology for beginners. And when you take that, you could do that right away and then join the first year course in November, and you'd be perfectly set up for it. But anyhow, in this program, over the course of about a year, we work through 30 lessons that I lead. And those lessons are all 2 to 3 hours each, including lecture, a little break, and a Q&A portion where we open up for people to come on mic and camera and ask questions and have an interactive discussion about the material for the day. The program is broken into modules that cover a variety of topics in ancient Hellenistic astrology. That is the earliest era of horoscopic astrology. And so if you don't know a lot about the different schools of astrology, Hellenistic astrology is going to be the kind of astrology that you see a lot of astrologers practicing nowadays. It's become more popular in the last 30 years or so. And that is due to the fact that a lot of ancient texts with some of the original techniques of horoscopic astrologers were recently translated into the English language, and it's created this renaissance in terms of the use of ancient approaches to astrology. I have a background in modern psychological, archetypal, and evolutionary astrology, and so of course I bring those things to the table, but the course is primarily focused on the excavation of ancient techniques and the spiritual philosophy that ancient astrologers also espoused. The closest thing that I can tell you to what that looks like is, ask this question: do you resonate with the philosophy that you hear me take on my YouTube channel? If so, then you're going to love this course in terms of its philosophical and spiritual approach, because the spiritual approach to astrology that I teach is really at the heart of the program. And that's a big part of my life. I approach astrology from a spiritual standpoint. It doesn't belong to one religion or one particular school of thought, but you will hear me talking about things like the soul, the belief in the transmigration of the soul. You'll hear me talk about the need to be soul-centered in our client approach to counseling in astrology. You'll hear me have an appreciation for psychological dimensions of astrology, but also ancient astrology is really very, very good at developing your predictive capacity. We talk about what kinds of predictions are appropriate, how to make appropriate predictions, how to be the right kind of astrologer for our clients without inducing any fear. So there's a lot of care that goes into the development of this craft. But ancient astrology is really amazing when it comes to honing your predictive abilities. And then what you'll find is in this program, there's also a pretty significant emphasis on the psychological dimensions and client care. Anyhow, we go into the roots of ancient Hellenistic astrology and its techniques in this program, and the 30 classes are broken into modules. We work through the history and philosophy. We work through planets, houses, signs, aspects, essential and accidental dignities. And then we get into approaches to the delineation of natal charts. And then at the end of the program, almost a third of the program is dedicated to live client readings, where you're going to see me meet with a person and apply what we've been studying for an hour-long reading. We take a break, we come back, and then we workshop. How did I do that? Why did I make these choices? How did I handle this or that came up in the reading? And it becomes easily the favorite part for most students of the entire program, because by that point, you've got so much theory that you're really ready to see it put into action. We alternate those live client practice sessions with hands-on practice, where students get to bring chart questions into class that we work on. And that's also something that most people really love. A lot of people will look at the curriculum and say, well, I already know planets, houses, and signs and aspects and dignities. But not if you haven't studied Hellenistic astrology, because the approach that ancient astrologers had to these topics is vastly different from the approach that modern astrologers take. So you will be, in a sense, relearning basic things in a brand new way. And I think a much more enriching, deep, and philosophically clear way. It's really nice to know the why behind things. This program and Hellenistic astrology in general is very good at helping you understand the why behind everything that we do. Also, it's really important to participate when you study astrology in a living lineage. So one of the reasons I don't let people jump ahead to my second or third year programs is because I want you to be entrained to a lineage, a particular way of doing things that comes from an astrologer who has a very living, busy, active practice and who has had teachers themselves. I think that's important for astrological learning. That's the model that my own learning take, and so that's what I really want students to take away from my programs. Anyhow, so all of that aside, the second year program focuses, after we build our understanding of the basic delineation techniques of birth charts, in year 2, we move into timing techniques, which is all about when the karma of a birth chart is going to be active and expressing itself throughout the course of a lifetime. That's year 2. Year 3 focuses on the development of counseling skills at a much deeper level. And then we also have a 1-year horary program, which is about the development of a very specific predictive technique that can be a really amazing tool to add to your kit. That is 4 years worth of training programs that we have. However, I want to mention that many people take our classes just for the sake, purely for the sake of their own personal growth. Taking these programs is very much like being taught how to utilize a technology that for yourself will be deeply useful for the rest of your life, and maybe for close friends or family members around you. Many people come through our programs taking that benefit away and will study through all 4 years of our programs with no intention of being professional. This is their hobby. This is a spiritual tool that will have it will pay dividends over a long period of time. However, many people without the intention to practice come into our courses and discover that they're actually good at it and may end up reading for other people part-time. And then there are students who are deeply, intensely motivated to practice for other people. And it is not that our programs really make those people successful. Our programs contribute to your development, but it really is that some people have a calling to practice professionally. And these programs are designed to give you all the tools you need to develop that confidence and to develop a really coherent set of tools and to entrain yourself to a lineage, which you can also develop your own unique style out of. So those are some of the kinds of people that take our programs, you might say. So the 30 classes on the year are then broken into modules. And in between modules, we have 2 course directors who are present in all of the classes, and they lead breakout tutoring sessions where you can come in and review or ask questions about the module that we've just completed, which is usually anywhere between 2 and 3 classes each. So those breakout study sessions led by our tutors are outside of the 30 classes and very useful. A lot of people like to attend those because they also offer opportunity for community and just lively conversation. We also have 12 online webinar classes led by guest teachers that we host throughout the year. Those are free, and if you can't make them live, they're all uploaded into your student folder. You also have an interactive group forum discussion staffed with tutors who typically respond to questions that you have about the material within 24 hours. So if you can't attend a tutoring session or you just have a random question on a Tuesday night, you can pop it in there and you'll get an answer. We also have a ton of bonus material, optional quizzes, flashcards, tons of supplemental material that is there to help people go as deeply as they want. We have a reading list that is expansive. And that reading list, we don't expect anyone to accomplish. It's more so a resource that we give you saying, here, if you want to know all the things I've read, if you want to know all the things that I love, if you want to know all the things I recommend, here's a master list of everything for each lesson. You could go, PhD level if you wanted to and read thousands and thousands of pages. Or you might find that there's just one extra book that looks really interesting and you want to pick it up. But we pride ourselves on making sure you have a ton of resources. You have lifetime access to all the class recordings. You can email our staff or me throughout the year with questions, and my staff will also defer to me in the case that they don't know the answer to a question. So that is what the program includes. It starts November 16th. If you would like to join, at the bottom between now and October 15th, our early bird payments are available. So that saves you some money off the cost of the course. There is a 12-month installment plan that is cheaper than our normal plan, a one-time payment that's significantly cheaper than our normal one-time payment. So you get these little sales that we do until October 15th. We also have need-based tuition assistance. So if you are someone who would like to take this program, but you are on a fixed or tight budget, we have an application there. Click apply now. Just tell us what you need. We give a range. We say between this dollar amount and this dollar amount, what can you spend? And then we set you up with a plan for that tuition number per month. And that is available for anyone. We ask people to apply early because those spots are limited, but we are really accommodating. We try to make sure that nobody's priced out of a spiritual education. Like, this topic should be very accessible for people because I believe that the divine is speaking through the sky, and like anyone should have access to understanding what it's saying, right? So anyway, that is a bit about the program. I hope that this has been useful for you. If there are any questions you have, you can look over the curriculum content on the page, on the year one page. There's more information there. Check out the FAQ section for more questions. Email us info@nightlightastrology.com. And I hope to see some of you in class soon. I think this is going to be a really powerful program because it's also starting right as Pluto is moving into Aquarius. And within the year, we're going to have a Uranus-Pluto trine with Uranus in Gemini. These Aries signatures and the connection between Uranus and Pluto make for a very powerful year to advance our understanding of astrology. So it's a great election year for studying. And I hope to see some of you in class soon.